Okay, this lesson for our chapter 1 is on different levels of organization within the human body. I think that the majority of this information is going to be pretty much review for most of you, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, we're going to go over it. So, it's important for us to recognize that the human body is organized both anatomically and physiologically. And we know from our previous lessons that by anatomically, we're talking structurally. And by physiologically, we're talking functionally. Right? So knowing that the human body is organized on both of these factors. So what exactly does that mean? What is the human body made of? So by structure, right, we can kind of think about the fact that similar structures are grouped together. The idea that bones are grouped with bones, right, in order to make up the skeletal system, right? But at the same time, functionally, we should know that body parts, a general term that I'm trying to think of what to use, body parts that perform similar jobs are grouped together as well. So the idea that the heart is directly related to the ability to pump blood, which is grouped together with blood vessels, which have the ability to carry that blood based on their particular functions, right? So we group things both structurally and functionally, which is, again, just further evidence for why we link together anatomy and physiology when we're going over the two different disciplines. So, this particular diagram should be relatively familiar to most of you. The idea of what different things make up the next level. I'm guessing that this top portion is the most familiar. The idea that cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up systems, and systems are what make up the organism. However, I'm not sure how much you've considered the smaller level of organization that exists within the human body. The idea that all of those cells are ultimately made of atoms, and those atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And it's how all of these little, minuscule things are really working together to create the whole, and how the body works on its own. So it's important for us to think about every level having its specific place. So, for example, the idea that these subatomic particles, right? We know that our electrons are our negatives, right? We typically E with a little negative sign. Our protons are P's with a positive, right? And our neutrons, which we tend to just, neutron, neutral, right? So no charge. That these subatomic particles are what make up atoms. That shouldn't really be much of a surprise, right? But those atoms are the building block of matter. We're matter, right? The human body is matter. It has volume. It takes up space. It has mass, right? So that means that ultimately we are made up of atoms, right? When we look at the atomic level, we're made up of hydrogen atoms, carbon atoms, oxygen atoms. That right there should be common sense. We should know that carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, when we start to put a little formula together, we know that those are carbohydrates. And yeah, human body is made up of carbohydrates, right? The human body is made up of proteins. The human body is made up of all of these different atoms because these things are what we eat, and our body rearranges them into the different structures that we're made of. So it's important for us to recognize that we do have an atomic level to us. So there is chemistry involved in anatomy and physiology, right? Those atoms join together to make up molecules, right? A water molecule, vitamin C, glucose. Those molecules link together, and we have macromolecules. We talked before about the idea of macro meaning large, right? Macromolecules are going to be these big molecules, frequently referred to as macromolecules of life, right? Macromolecules of life is really typically a fancy way of talking about organic compounds, and that organic compounds should be reviewed, right, from biology. We talked about how important organic compounds are for living things, right? Humans are alive. Our bodies and how they function depend on organic compounds, depend on these macromolecules of life, proteins, DNA, all of these different things. Those molecules and macromolecules are going to make up the organelles, the specific structures within a cell that have their particular jobs, right? They're specialized. So you have the mitochondria. We know that the mitochondria is for energy, the mighty mitochondria, right? We have the Golgi apparatus for packaging and distribution, right? They're all specialized. They all have a specific function, a specific job, right? And they're organized and they're built up made of molecules and macromolecules. It's how those molecules and macromolecules kind of come together, bond together to create all of these different little organelles. Last year in biology class, we talked about how the cell membrane, right? Cell membrane being one of the organelles of a cell, that the cell membrane has proteins embedded within it, right? So the cell membrane's function depends on certain macromolecules. And it should not be any sort of surprise that the organelles coming together and working together are what make up the actual cells itself, right? And depending on what the specific function of a cell is, so meaning a muscle cell versus a nerve cell, right, its organelles are going to differ. A muscle cell is going to contain a substantial number of mitochondria. It's going to need that energy to have that contractile ability, right? So various organelles are going to be found in different quantities and different cells throughout the body. Those cells are then going to be able to be assembled based on their similarities and their properties into tissues, right? So tissues, we group together those specific cells that have their specific jobs. So we're grouping together muscle cells, we're grouping together nerve cells, right? And we're creating tissue, right? So the idea that these specific cells have their specific function. So parietal cells in the stomach that are specifically supposed to make the hydrochloric acid, stomach acids, all right? Mucus cells, specifically to produce mucus. But if you look, they're both in the stomach, all right? Because we're only at the tissue level. We're not talking about an organ level yet, right? So we have different types of tissues, right, that are made of these different groups of cells to do their job. We have epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, all right? Different types of tissue to do different types of jobs. Then those tissues are going to combine in order to create our organs, right? So when different types of tissues join together, organs are formed. Notice, right? 2 or more types. We're not only talking about one type of tissue in an organ. Organs are complex, so they're going to have different types of tissues working together to create the total functional role of that organ, right? Organs carry out pretty complex jobs, which means that the different things that they're made of are going to need to be able to build up that capability of performing the job. So typically organs also have distinct shapes. We know the shape of the lungs, right? You guys got to see my horrible drawings, right? Which kind of look like Dumbo ears. We know that these organs are often recognized based on their shapes, right? But their main thing is about their functionality, is about what jobs they're supposed to carry out, and they can only carry out those jobs if the little pieces that they're made of, the tissues, the cells, the atoms, if those things are working properly together. Then we have the organs that all come together and work as well, right? Once those organs come together and work, we have a system, an organ system. So those different organs coming together, for example, we talked about the heart before, and the blood vessels, that they're working together for the same overall purpose, right? They have the same common goal. All right, here I'm talking about the digestive system. Before I mentioned, right, cardiovascular, right? The circulatory system, that the idea that heart pumping blood, vessels carrying blood, right? But when we look at it, it's really about each of those organs performing their job so that the system as a whole can operate optimally. If all of those different systems are operating optimally, they can interact the way that they're supposed to. So for the circulatory system, the idea that if the blood is flowing properly, and if all the vessels are operating properly, that then the blood will be able to get to all of the cells so that the cells can do all the things that they're supposed to do. So that the blood can reach the lungs so that it can carry oxygen. But it's only going to get the oxygen if the lungs are performing their job of being able to transport the oxygen across that surface into the blood vessels, right? So the idea is that those organ systems really need to be optimally functioning and working together in order for that organism to function, right? Ultimately, what it comes down to is all of these little pieces working together to keep you alive, right? That the atoms have to work together, right? Come together, bond together in order to create the organelles that perform jobs. And those organelles that perform their jobs are what are ultimately going to be able to assemble cells that perform their specific jobs. Those cells will join together with similar cells to create tissues that do jobs. And it continuously builds until you have a fully functioning human being that operates the way it's supposed to. So that pretty much wraps it up with our levels of organization. Again, if you have any questions, please come see me.